When I was asked to contribute to a list that the New York Times were making about the best 100 books of the 21st century so far, firstly, I was very flattered. I genuinely was convinced that the email was fake and just a spam thing that had come to me by accident. I kept checking that it was real. And then once I had discerned that this was in fact a serious request, I was shocked because it was an honor to be asked to contribute to this. But then I realized how big a deal this was. I knew it was going to be big, but I think that I didn't quite fathom how big this would be, how big this would become, how this would be the big news story of that particular week. Of course, then the news cycle moved on and Joe Biden announced that it was Jova for his presidential campaign and that Kamala is Brat. Since then, it's been a Kamala nomenon. So many other things have happened, but I wanted to talk about this because I thought it was so interesting as a cultural moment. And of course, I make videos about the publishing industry, about books, and I was lucky enough to contribute to this list. I wanted to talk about it because I have many thoughts, some completely non-biased thoughts. There's no agreement there, there's no NDA. I can talk freely about this completely. And so today we are going to be talking about the list, but also why lists like this exist, who they are made for, who their target audience is, how this particular list came together, also how there is now an alternative list of reader's choice as opposed to this one, which is the critic's choice. I want to talk about who is not featured in this list, what has been omitted, what is the kind of blind spots of this list, but also the value of lists in general, why we have this desire to itemize things, to assign a hierarchy of value, a desire, I suppose, that we have to determine that one thing is better than another, especially when it comes to things that are mostly just subjective. And of course, at the very end, at the bitter end of this video, I will also be going through the full list of the 100 best books of the century so far, according to the New York Times. So this was the contents of the email that I received. To mark the 25th year of this still young century, we are reaching out to hundreds of book enthusiasts and experts. Guess which one? I was definitely an enthusiast. Not necessarily an expert. Try my best though. Anyway, in an attempt to discern the best books of the 21st century, the team are conducting a poll with hundreds of novelists, non-fiction writers, librarians, poets, booksellers, editors, critics, journalists, and artists. And you know what? As the internet's resident librarian, I was honoured to be involved. In the end, 503 literary luminaries, as they were called, responded, participated, submitted a ballot, and basically each person was able to submit a ballot of their 10 picks. And I have to say, I do think that literary luminary is the best compliment I've ever received in my whole entire life. It's not getting any better than that. Someone could declare their undying love for me, like maybe even I'm getting married and someone else in the crowd objects and gives me like a Jane Austen style speech about how in love with me they are, and it still won't top being referred to as a literary luminary. That's just perfect. It's honestly all I've ever wanted, and if you do see me with literary luminary in my like Tinder bio in the future, mind your business. I might add it as my like email sign off, Jack Edwards, literary luminary. I just love it. Do I think it's accurate? No, but I'll take it. That's done more for my mental wellness than years of therapy ever could. So thank you, New York Times. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I'm going to be dining out on that one for a while. Other contributors to the list. I love how I'm referring to the list like it's some blockbuster movie, like The List. But other contributors included Min Jin Lee, Roxane Gay, Marlon James, James Patterson, Bonnie Garmus, and even Stephen King, who, this is insane, but Stephen King actually submitted one of his own books on his ballot. I kind of wonder if he knew that his ballot would be made public information, because it is a little outrageous, but also if anyone can do it, it is Stephen King. So fair enough. You gotta believe in your own source. I wish I had an ounce of the self-confidence that Stephen King has. The other funny thing is that that book didn't even make the list. So it wasn't even like this vindicating moment where he was like, I told you. It's not even on the list. So I just think, can you imagine if I had submitted my own book? People would have burnt me at the stake. Book Twitter came for me when I said that The Hunger Games should be considered a modern classic. Let alone if I did that with my own book, they would have had my head on a spike. They would have been rioting at dawn. What I need you to know is that I did not do that. Not that I would have done it, but I also didn't know that was possible. I didn't know that we could do that. These were the instructions that we were sent. We want you to pick the 10 books, fiction or non-fiction, published in the United States in English on or after January 1st, 2000. Fun fact, Ice Spice's birthday. I don't know why I know that. What childhood memory have I forgotten in order to remember, to be able to recall that the 1st of January 2000 is Ice Spice's birthday? I don't know. So the book had to be published from January 1st, 2000 up until the present day. These had to be books that we considered to be the best, understanding that each of you may define the term differently. Brilliantly written, utterly pleasurable, powerfully important. Use your judgment. Now, that was the New York Times' first mistake, because I don't trust my own judgment. They absolutely should not trust mine either. But I do think that is the most important thing to note here, that this was very much up to interpretation. Each individual person, it was up to their interpretation. And I suppose that's where the rule of averages comes in, because if each person has their own criterion of what they think is the best, then I guess over 503 people, it should kind of level out, and the anomalies, the outliers, will kind of be irrelevant. And books that were consistently chosen as the best in a range of categories, in loads of different people's interpretation of what the best could be, would be the overall best. Right? I kind of get it. I will say, I personally went for a mix of books that I found to be incredibly written. Like, I thoroughly enjoyed my reader experience. I felt like no word was wasted. I felt like each sentence had been meticulously crafted. But for me, the thing that separates just really good writing to being the best and being worthy of being on my ballot was also that they had some kind of impact on the publishing industry as a whole. Like books that changed the way we think about writing, books that changed what the written word could be. Maybe that's because they introduced a new voice or a new style or a new structure. But to me, those books are incredibly influential, not only to me on a personal level because they've opened my eyes to things that I didn't already know about or hadn't considered, but also because they've done that on a much wider scale. And I suppose the reason that these broad definitions were used was because there were so many contributors. When you have a book prize like the Booker Prize, there's a committee of just 5 or 6 judges. And so, of course, they have to be very specific to make sure that they are all aligned as a committee. The New York Times seemed to have decided that a larger sample size would yield more accurate results. But the other crucial difference between this list and a literary prize is that contributors had not read every single book that qualified. And also that wouldn't be possible. Whereas in a literary prize, there is a pool of books that are eligible and the committee spend time poring over each one and reading each one in detail, in depth. The important thing to remember is that no one participant in this New York Times survey had read every book that had been published this century so far, because that's not possible. Words Rated reported that around 305 books are published in the United States per year, and on the contrary, around 163 books are eligible for a prize like the Booker Prize each year. So the judges in a prize like that are able to come to a fair judgment that recognizes this is the pick of this committee. And they have read every book that was submitted and come to a conclusion. That's not the case with this New York Times list. That can never happen because no one person has read every book published this century. So it's already limited. It can in no way be an objective list. Not that book prizes are objective lists, but inherent in the nature of a book prize is that it is recognition from this committee in this particular year. We can kind of accept that. This kind of authority that the list claims doesn't really exist. I think we can use it as a guiding light because people who spend a lot of time reading and have read a lot of books have chosen these ones, but it is not objective. And that is very important to always bear in mind. This list did not just fall out of a coconut tree. It exists within the context of all in which it lives and what came before it. My own submissions were, of course, limited to only the books that I have read. I have read almost 1,000 books in my 25 years on this earth, but inevitably my knowledge of the literary landscape is flawed because it's based on my tastes, my interests, what I have happened to encounter. I also will hold my hands up and say I've had less time because I was not reading Atonement when I was 2. So if you consider my kind of adult life to just have been the last decade since I was 15, for me, my list is just books that I've read in the last 10 years. Like I haven't been reading these books for 25 years. I mean, I could have submitted The Gruffalo. I think that's a great book. When was The Gruffalo published? Oh, it was published on the 23rd of March, 1999. No wonder The Gruffalo wasn't number 1. It's all making a lot more sense now. Justice for The Gruffalo. Okay, fine. That was last century. But also, I will hold my hands up and say that when the list came out, I realized that I had read only 25 of them, of the 100 books that are considered to be the best books of the century so far. And reading and literature and the pursuit of literary knowledge has been what I've committed my adult life to. I studied a literature degree, I've worked in publishing, I've worked in libraries, my full-time job now is working with books. And honestly, I actually wonder if any one person has read all 100. I'm sure a lot of people will be on a mission now to read the full 100, but I wonder if there is any one person who had read all 100 before the list was published. I'm genuinely not sure. I would probably put money on there not being one person who had read all of those books. And so I wanted to talk about how in some ways this list is a helpful resource, but it has to be considered as that, a resource or a reference point, but by no means a holy grail. And also you shouldn't feel any shame if you haven't read many of the books on this list. There's a whole conversation going on Book Talk right now about anti-intellectualism, but I would like to remind you, you are allowed to read what you are interested in, what fascinates you, what brings you joy. You don't have to read books that other people tell you you should read. It's all a bit of fun. This is a hobby. This is something that we are meant to enjoy. Don't let anyone ever be a snob or shame you for what you read. Who cares? Firstly, let's talk about the limitations of the list. Straight off the bat, the ranking system isn't explained. We don't know the metric for how they decided which book placed where. Now, naturally, it seems like the list should just be the book that received the most votes would be number one. But if that were the case, they probably would have told us how many votes each book got, which they didn't do. This list does not say this book received this many votes, therefore it is in 6th place or 53rd place or 72nd place. The list is not based on how many votes each book got, therefore it is curated. We don't know how many votes the number one book got. We also don't know if it got more votes than any of the other books. We know that 503 people contributed to the list, but we don't know what percentage of those 503 people voted for My Brilliant Friend, which was voted the number one best book of the century so far. We also don't know how many people voted for each one. So that is a bit of a mystery. And this brings me on to the concept of curation. The New York Times article says this: these are the 100 best books of the 21st century as voted on by 503 novelists, non-fiction writers, poets, critics, and other book lovers, with a little help from the New York Times book review staff. What I want to know is how much help is a little help? To what extent did the New York Times book review staff curate this list? Was it a list they'd already made that they then sort of reshuffled a bit once they had our contributions? Did they already have the list and then we just helped with the ranking with our submissions? I guess we'll never know. Also, when we submitted our ballot, the New York Times then gave us this kind of like mini game. It was essentially a this or that kind of thing. So it would come up with like 2 book covers and it would say, which of these 2 books is better? Which of these 2 books did you prefer? Or there was also a button to say, I haven't read this one. I'm intrigued by that. I haven't heard that mentioned at all since. And I'm wondering what part that had to play in helping them rank things. How much weight did that activity have? Or was I just sitting there for hours, essentially doing it for no reason? Next, I do think that there is some degree of intellectual snobbery involved in the curation of this list. And that's probably best illustrated by the fact that there is a distinct lack of genre fiction. We can see a handful of fantasy or sci-fi books. The romance genre is considerably lacking, especially considering how important romance books are to the kind of ecosystem of publishing, and also how popular they are and how much they shape the culture, as is YA. YA is also really considerably lacking. Regardless of J.K. Rowling's recent behaviour, I was incredibly surprised not to see a single Harry Potter book on the list. But also, I didn't vote for it. Maybe there were some books that people thought were so inevitably going to be on the list that they thought their vote was better used elsewhere, and so felt more inclined to vote for their underdog favourites, you know? Also, maybe a series splits the vote. So, for example, at the Harry Potter books, there's 7 books. So if that vote is divided 7 ways because each person has a different favourite book from the series, maybe that impacted things. Whereas a standalone book would not have that issue. All of the votes would be directed at one. Having said that, 2 of Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet made the list, the first one and the last one in the series, as well as another one of her books, The Days of Abandonment. I mentioned it before, I will mention it again. The Hunger Games also wasn't on this list, despite becoming a cultural touchstone. You know, it has impacted the lexicon, it has impacted the way that we speak. People reference the Hunger Games, things being Hunger Games-esque very frequently. To me, that's the same as the way that George Orwell's 1984 infiltrated our vocabulary. While 1984 introduced terms like Big Brother and Room 101, Doublethink, and more, The Hunger Games introduced things like I Volunteer as Tribute. Many people and cultural commentators pointed out that this year's Met Gala was reminiscent of The Hunger Games, that the people attending were like the Capitol. We all recognise what this means. But again, the definition of best is broad. It doesn't necessarily mean which book had the biggest cultural impact. It's up to interpretation. Also, I wonder how many young people were surveyed. The people who grew up with Harry Potter or grew up with The Hunger Games, you know? The list also features only one graphic novel and one poetry collection. I think this post kind of sums up the shock of only one poetry collection being on the list best. Are there any poetry books on the New York Times best books of the 21st century list, or is the literary genre that attends most closely to the multifaceted possibilities of language, has the deepest historical roots, and is most likely to reward rereadings, completely ignored per usual? Could not have put it better myself, but also I didn't put forward any poetry. So I'm also having to think about, you know, my own bias and what I considered to be worthy of the list. The conversation and the discourse after this has come out has made me reconsider how I curated my list too. Another limitation is, of course, that the list is incredibly America-centric. The criteria was that the book needed to be published in the United States in English this century. As a result, world literature, and specifically translated literature, I think really suffered. It's a bit of a grey area because translated books that may have been published in their native languages last century, but then were only translated into English this century, could then qualify as a best book of this century, even though they weren't written in this century. And that brings up a whole new series of complexities and complications. For instance, the first English translation of the Iliad by Homer was published in around 1581. This would not qualify for the best books of the 21st century, obviously. However, Emily Wilson released a new translation of the Iliad in 2023. So based on this criteria, that one would be eligible because that book was published in English in the US this century. Do you see the issue? Because now the list is missing the Iliad by Homer. But should we think about, oh, it's only the first translation into English that should be considered? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Olga Ravin, who is an incredible writer, she wrote the books My Work, The Employees, she took to Twitter to talk about this. I don't understand the rules for the New York Times 100 books of the century. Many of the translated titles were originally published in the last century, which leads me to the conclusion that whoever made the list does not think a book is published until it is published in English. That is a really tricky conundrum. And Olga Ravin pointed out that the Copenhagen trilogy, which was originally written by Tove Ditlevsen and then translated by Tilna Nonnally and Michael Favela Goldman in 2021, was on the list, but was originally published in Danish in 1967. So this is essentially a book from last century that was translated into English this century that has now made it onto the list of the best books of this century. Do you see what I mean? So in some ways, translated books exist in a space in between then and now. They can exist in both the last century and this one, depending on how you look at it. And I suppose you could argue that even though the list does center America and the English language, translations published this century should be considered because otherwise they wouldn't ever be considered. You know, if a list was created last century, these books hadn't been translated into English yet. So they wouldn't have been considered at all, specifically in a New York Times list, which is catering to the English-speaking world. So I personally think that translations published this century should be considered. And I also put forward some translations in my personal ballot because I think that translated books are just as important, you know, obviously. And since no one in the world speaks every single language, there is no list that would ever be able to accurately consider each book in the century that it was originally published or the year that it was originally published. No alternative actually exists. So yes, the list is America and English centric, but you do have to take it with a pinch of salt. It centers English books, it centers publication in America, but that was part of the criteria for this specific list. So again, it is not a definitive ranking, and this is just another way of proving that it could never be. 13 of the top 100 books are translations, including the book in the number 1 spot and 2 others in the top 10. You can be the judge of whether you think that is proportionate, whether that is fair, but I do think there was a severe lack of world literature, books that were not about the Western world. I mean, really, above all, even the metrics are kind of arbitrary, 25 years, 100 books, the 21st century, 503 critics. These are all essentially random numbers. And so after all this, why bother making this list in the first place? If we know these lists are inevitably limited, why should we continue making them? Why even pay attention to this? Why was this big news? Well, they do introduce us to books that we may not have considered or come across before. When you walk into a bookstore, it can be overwhelming. Even looking at my shelves behind me, it's overwhelming. Not knowing where to start or which book is worth your time. You have to pay to buy a book or wait to lend it at your local library. It's also not only a financial investment, but also a time investment. A book is something that you have to commit to. It's not like a movie where you may have lost 2 hours of your time. Most people, on average, read a handful of books per year, and so people do want guidance as to which ones they should commit to. And that can be for a range of reasons. It might be that it's entertaining, that it's bingeable, that it is relaxing, or that it provides escapism. It also may be that that book is intellectually stimulating or informs them about something, that it's educational. Or it can be a mix of all of those things, and that is the beauty of literature. And our kind of endless supply of it. Isn't part of the pleasure of pursuing knowledge through literature the fact that it's a task that can never be completed? It's a mission with an ever-expanding goal. Isn't it what Samuel Johnson said, that to pursue perfection was to chase the sun? We never want to actually touch the sun, we would burn. But the entire time that you're chasing after it, you are basking in the warmth of its glow. That's what it is to pursue knowledge through literature, I think. That the entire time you do so, you are rewarded. You learn more. You learn empathy. You learn about people outside of yourself. You also can learn more about yourself. That's why I have this channel, talking about books, not because I'm an authority or an expert on literature, or because I've read every single book ever, or that my perspective is objective. It's entirely subjective. But I can read widely and diversely and in lots of different genres, and then feed back to you and curate lists of books that I think different people will like, different types of people, different purposes for reading, different environments, different vibes. I don't know. I hope that my job is to help you kind of get through all the noise and find something that you'll actually really love. And even if you don't love it, I hope that the books that I recommend would give you something to think about and to discuss, and that may challenge you. Whether that's that it's intellectually challenging, or whether it just challenges you to think, why did I like this? Or why did I not like this? And these lists exist in every single industry, whether that's the top 10 restaurants to eat in London or Paris or New York or Tokyo, or the top 10 albums of the year. Maybe it's the best video games of the decade, or the best ice cream flavor. These things are inevitably subjective. They are inevitably flawed. They are inevitably imperfect, but they give us guidance and inspiration, and that does count for something. Psychology shows that there's a certain amount of information people can juggle, says Fiskoff, senior editor of the Journal of Media Psychology and a blogger for Psychology Today. We end up coming up with a reduction technique to simplify data. If we can break things up into chunks of meaningful data, it's much easier for us to store and remember them. And that is why attaching a number to information helps us to recall it. People are more likely to remember the top 10 albums of the year, for instance, if they see them laid out in a numbered list. If they read a story that simply mentioned the albums, they'd be less likely to remember them. The number of ranking lists on the internet especially is just astronomical, is just huge. And you can actually see this study that was conducted, which shows how much more likely a list was to be a multiple of 10 or 5 than anything else. We're more likely to click on a list of the top 100 than a list of the top 87, for example. I also found when I was researching this that people perceive the gap between 10 and 11 to be way bigger than the gap between, let's say, 9 and 10, or 8 and 9, or 7 and 8, because there's something about 11 which is like excluded from the top 10. It didn't quite make the top 10. So the top 10 exists as this kind of higher tier. And then the number 11, because it's one step out of that top 10, feels like it kind of failed to reach something, even though it's been considered the 11th best thing. So people tend to perceive the difference between 10 and 11 as much greater than like the difference between 14 and 15, or 28 and 29. A guy called Rex Sorgast, who refers to himself as a listologist, says that he thinks of lists as predictions of memories that will last. There's this form of nostalgia tied to them, but I actually think of them in terms of the future. They're really more about attempts to define what we're going to remember. It's sort of a declaration of what will be remembered about this time in the future. And I suppose that's really what this particular list that we're thinking about is meant to represent. Before we continue, I'm excited to let you know that today's video is very kindly brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform for building a website or an online brand. And the best news is you don't need to be an expert coder or a web developer, because Squarespace has hundreds of incredible templates which you can use and customize to bring your vision to life. Here you can see that I've started to create my own website kind of portfolio, so that if people want to work with me, they can find the work that I've done and also my contact information, etc. And it's really important to put your best foot forward, and with Squarespace, that is guaranteed. And this was so easy to just start off with a template and then customize it. And there are loads of really great inbuilt features within Squarespace. So for example, they have AI SEO to make sure that the website that you've created appears on search results. Also, there's the ability to create a blog and an email sign up. So basically everything you need is just at the touch of a button. So if this all sounds good, you can head to squarespace.com right now for a free trial. And then when you're ready to launch your beautiful new website, you can use the code jackedwards at squarespace.com/jackedwards to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much to Squarespace for working with me, and on with the video. I think a lot about how nostalgia impacts our ranking or our reviews of art, especially in the context of music. You know, when a new album by a big artist is released, a lot of people are like, oh, it's nothing compared to their previous one, you know, after the very first listen. And I think that's incredibly reductive. I try not to have immediate responses to things like that anymore. When a new album by my favorite artist comes out, I try not to think about it in terms of, is this better than their previous work? Is this their best yet? Because I don't yet have nostalgia attached to it. You know, I haven't heard this song at full blast in my car, or when I'm at the club, or when I'm laying on a beach, or when I'm falling in love. I have no memories associated with it yet. It hasn't soundtracked a part of my life yet. I haven't listened to it when I was going through heartbreak yet. I haven't listened to it when I move into a new home yet. But those things will come, just like I have those memories associated with their previous work. I guess what I'm trying to say is that you haven't yet tested that thing's lasting power, whereas you know that their previous work does have lasting power because you still respect it, you still rate it highly, at least enough to be interested in that same artist's newer work. I think it's the same with books. You know, sometimes people are like, oh, this new book is nowhere near as good as the book I read from this author 15 years ago. But is that partly because you've spent the last 15 years thinking of that book as one of your favorites? You know, you spent 15 years detached from what is actually written on the page and instead attached to the abstract idea of it, and that you've got so used to saying that that thing is your favorite. You know, I'll be honest and say that there are books that I consider to be my favorite books that I couldn't really tell you much of what happens in them. I don't really remember a lot of the character names, the place names, the locations, etc. I just remember how it made me feel, and I remember that I loved it at the time. And, you know, maybe because a decade has passed where I've been telling people that's my favorite book, it's kind of ingrained in there. I don't know. And I think that is all to do with nostalgia. And nostalgia is an interesting word. The word nostalgia actually comes from the Greek nostos, meaning return home, and then algos, which meant pain. And it was used by poets like Homer to refer to the Trojan War, for example, because of the pain that the sailors would feel when they were missing home. Not just because they missed home, but also because they were missing a home they knew they would never return to. Or at least that if they did return, their home would have changed so much in the meantime while they were at war. So nostalgia isn't just memory. It's not just reflecting. It's also feeling pain that you will never be able to go back to that place. That is a home you can never return to. You know, we feel nostalgia when we think about our childhood home, or maybe a holiday or a friendship or a relationship. You know, you feel nostalgia because it's something you can never get back. Anyways, that was a kind of weird and unnecessary tangent about why I think nostalgia impacts our reflections of the art that we discuss. But that aside, I also listened to a podcast episode from Kellogg Insight, which pointed out that a ranking system is also a kind of clickbait, because a ranking system is a way of creating many, many discussion points. By ranking things 22 and 53 and 91, there's way more nuance to the conversation, because it's not just which books made the list, it's also which order were those things put in the list. And that creates an infinite number of possibilities of places you could disagree. You might say, I think that 21 and 52 should have been swapped, or that book's in the top 10, but it should only have been in the top 50. Now the conversation is not just, is it on the list? It's also, where on the list is it? Did you see that this book was ranked higher than this one? Can you believe that this book didn't crack the top 90? It's a way of generating a myriad of conversations. And ultimately, That's what these publications want you to do. They want everyone on Twitter or on social media or on TikTok, whatever, to be talking about their list and discussing it. And you know why? Because that means more people will click on their website and read the list. And you know what that means? More money from advertisement. This list, for example, the New York Times list, is behind a paywall. So if you wanted to view it, you had to pay to play. You had to subscribe to the New York Times. They generate income from people clicking on that website. It's capitalism, baby. Side note, I was recently in a bookshop and I found this kind of yassified version of the Communist Manifesto. And I felt like Karl Marx was just rolling in his grave at this new design. And what's interesting was that this New York Times list was released bit by bit. They released 20 of the list at a time. And that, of course, was to maximize the engagement that this story was getting day by day. Fresh discussion and engagement was being generated every day. They unraveled and revealed a further part of this list. And we fell right into the trap. I'm falling into the trap right now by continuing to talk about it. But it was kind of fun, wasn't it? Every day, people were able to discuss the selection, which books hadn't been revealed yet, whether they would be revealed in a later part of the ranking, where the books of that day had been ranked. Would your favorite book be featured higher or not at all? You know, it was kind of a bit of a sensation. It's sensationalized on purpose. Now, why did this list specifically generate so much attention? Well, because it's the New York Times. And they are a kind of authority in the literary world because they publish the bestseller list. Their reviews are well respected, it is a well-known and recognizable publication, but because they publish the bestseller list, they are seen as kind of gatekeepers in the industry. They have the data. They know which books are selling the most copies. You know, it's a big deal for a book to have New York Times bestseller on the cover. And so we have assigned them the role, the title of industry expert. And of course, they also, as a result of that, had access to big name authors like Min Jin Lee, like Stephen King, like Marlon James. So I think that this list was a discussion point by the very nature of it being a ranking list, which is designed to generate conversation, but also because it was by the New York Times, who are an authority in the industry. Now, there are some pretty major snubs and omissions on this list. There was no Haruki Murakami, there was no Sally Rooney. The books Gone Girl and Braiding Sweetgrass were missing, which I was really surprised about. The Idiot was missing. There were lots of Booker Prize winners, Pulitzer Prize winners, Nobel Prize winners that were not on the list, despite the Women's Prize or the National Book Awards determining certain books to be the best books of their respective years. They were not featured on the list. But you know what's interesting is that the New York Times themselves were critical of their own list. They were kind of recognizing the fact that the list was imperfect the entire time. They knew it would be divisive. They knew it could not represent absolutely everyone. The list has limitations, inevitably. They were engaging in the discourse. They were the ones who encouraged readers to create their own list, and then they published it. Ultimately, the New York Times wanted to spark conversations. And look, we're here, a month later, still talking about it. And really, the more people talking about books, the better, I think. I personally really love the coverage from the New York Times about books because I think that they are open-minded to discussion and discourse. One thing I loved about their list was that it had tick boxes under each of the books. So you could tick whether you had A, read the book, or B, if you wanted to read the book. And that recognizes that this is an aspirational list. It isn't like a you should have read all of these books. You are dumb if you haven't read all of these books. You are anti-intellectual if you haven't read all of these books. It's like, hey, maybe you could aim to read some of these books. But the very presence of the tick box means that it's also possible to leave it unticked. It's also possible to say, I don't want to read that one, thank you very much, New York Times. I like that it acknowledged that not everyone would have read every single book. Most people would not have read every single book, but also that not everyone would want to read every single book. And I think that's really crucial because that takes away the snobbery of it all. That takes away the intimidation of it all. And it makes this film more accessible, which I think is really nice. I do feel like this wasn't meant as like a shaming activity, like shame on you, you haven't read The Underground Railroad. But instead acknowledges that this is a list you can dip in and out of, and that's part of the fun. Like I said, it's guidance, and maybe this has helped draw attention to the books that are on the list, but it's also helped draw attention to the books that weren't. I've seen huge discourse online about how Tommy Orange and the book There was not included on the list, despite how important this book is. It was on my ballot. I want that on the record. There was on my ballot. I think it's one of the most important books of the century so far. It is all about Native Americans and different members of that community. We see lots of different people who all come together in this one collision at a powwow, and it is just completely captivating and so profound and moving. People saying that and getting involved in the conversation hopefully has led more people to read There There by Tommy Orange, you know, and that's part of the beauty too. So sometimes omission can be just as impactful as admission to the list. I know I have personally seen so many people on my For You page and in my feed recommending books that they think should have been on the list, and I'm sure you have too. A lot of the time I've seen these recommendations and thought, that sounds great. Noted. I really want to read that book now. And I mentioned this before, but they also released a readers list. So at the end of the list, readers could submit their choice, their ballot of the 10 books that they thought deserved to be the top 100 books of the 21st century so far. And that list is a very interesting list. It's much more reflective, I would say, of what you see when you go into a bookstore. You know, what's being displayed on the tables, what consumers are actively buying. A major criticism of the critics list was that it was maybe just a little bit safe and dull even. There are a bunch of books on that list, even in the top 10, that I have read and really didn't like. The readers list, I think at least, is a lot more dynamic. I will say that it's definitely a victim of recency bias. Even the book that won, the book that is at the number one spot, like at the top of the podium on the readers list, is a book that was on my ballot, but I also do think the fact that it is number one overall of the readers list is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. Now, this book only came out last year, and so I do think that it is a bit of a case of recency bias. In the same way I was talking about nostalgia, I also think we have recency bias of like the books that we really recently resonated with. I think there's a bit of an area in the middle where things get lost, and I had read 51 of the books on the Reader's Choice list as opposed to 25 on the Critics' Choice list. So I actually made a second channel video where I went through every single one on the Reader's Choice list. Now, in this video, I thought I would go through the 100 best books of the 21st century so far, according to 503 literary luminaries. Of course, as we've discussed, with a little bit of help, an undisclosed amount of help from the New York Times book review staff. So this is the list. At number 100, we have Tree of Smoke by Dennis Johnson. At 99, How to Be Both by Ali Smith. At 98, Bel Canto by Anne Patchett. Men We Reaped by Jessamine Ward. Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments by Saidiya Hartman. Bring Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel at number 95. Zadie Smith on Beauty. Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. The Days of Abandonment by Elena Ferrante. The Human Stain by Philip Roth. And at number 90, Viet Van Nguyen's The Sympathizer. At 89, we have The Return by Hisham Mata, followed by The Collective Stories of Lydia Davis by Lydia Davis, Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, Frederick Douglass by David W. Blight, Pastoralia by George Saunders. At 84, The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddhartha Mukherjee. At 83, When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut, Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melcher, Pulphead by John Jeremiah Sullivan. And at number 80, our second book by Elena Ferrante, but not our last, The Story of the Lost Child. Into the 70s, at 79, we have A Manual for Cleaning Women by Lucia Berlin. Septology by John Foss. This is really interesting because it's multiple stories included in one collection. An American Marriage by Tayari Jones at 77. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. The Passage of Power by Robert Caro at 73. Secondhand Time by Svetlana Alexievich at 72. The aforementioned The Copenhagen Trilogy in at 71. And at 70, All Aunt Hager's Children by Edward P. Jones. At number 69, we have The New Jim Crow, and this is by Michelle Alexander. The Friend by Sigrid Nunes is number 68. Next, we have Far From the Tree by Andrew Solomon. We the Animals by Justin Torres. The Plot Against America by Philip Roth. At 64, The Great Believers by Rebecca Mackay. Veronica by Mary Gateskill. 10:04 by Ben Lerner. At 61, we have Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead. Like I said, this is at the number one spot on the readers list. Heavy by Kies Lehman takes us to number 60. Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides is at number 59. Stay True by Hua Su. Nickel and Dimed or Not Getting By in America by Barbara Ehrenreich is at number 57. The Flamethrowers by Rachel Kushner. The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright. 10th of December by George Saunders is at number 54. 53 is Alice Munro with Runaway. Train Dreams by Dennis Johnson. Life After Life by Kate Atkinson. And Trust by Hernan Diaz round out our first 50. Then in at 49, we have The Vegetarian by Han Kang. At 48, Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. At 47, Toni Morrison with A Mercy. Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch. The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. Post-War by Tony Judd. A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James. At 41, we have Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. And at 40, H is for Hawk, and that is by Helen MacDonald. At 39, we have A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan. The Savage Detectives by Roberto Bolaño at 38. The Years by Annie Ernaux. Ta-Nehisi Coates with Between the World and Me is at 36. Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. Citizen by Claudia Rankine. Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward. The Line of Beauty by Alan Hollinghurst. White Teeth by Zadie Smith. And at 30, we have Sing, Unburied Sing, the third entry for Jesmyn Ward. Into the 20s now. At 29, we have The Last Samurai by Helen Dewitt. At 28, Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Ian McEwan's Atonement is at 26. The top 25 is started by Random Family by Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc. The Overstory by Richard Powers. At 23, another entry for Alice Munro with Hateship, Friendship, Courtship, Loveship, Marriage. At 22, Behind the Beautiful Forevers by Catherine Boo. At 21, Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And now the top 20. We have Erasure by Percival Everett. At 19, Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. At 18, Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, another entry for him. The Sellout by Paul Beatty makes its way to number 17. At 16, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. Pachinko by Minjin Lee is number 15. At 14, Outline by Rachel Cusk. At 13, The Road by Cormac McCarthy. At 12, The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. Number 11 is The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz. Into the top 10, we have Marilyn Robinson with Gilead. At 9, Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. At 8, Austerlitz, and that is by W.G. Sebald. Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad is at number 7. At number 6, we have 2666, and that is another entry for Roberto Bolaño. Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections is at number 5. At 4, we have The Known World, and that is by Edward P. Jones. Number 3 is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Number 2 is The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. And of course, number 1 is My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that this, I guess, was an additional discussion piece of this list and the role of lists in general. Let me know in the comment section below which book you think is the number 1 book of the century so far. If you want to know which books I chose, you can head to the video that I made at the time that I was submitting my ballot of the top books that I think will be classics in the future. Modern books I think we'll still be studying in 100 years from now. But yeah, let me know in the comment section who would have been on your ballot of 10, what you think is the best book of the century so far, what you think of this list, anything else you want to add to the discussion. I love reading the comments on these videos and just getting to nerd out with you all. So you can also follow me over on Instagram, on TikTok, on my second channel, etc, etc. Love you to the moon and back. Thank you so much for watching this video. All the best, stay in touch, have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you very, very soon. Bye-bye.